Part 4. Back at my apartment, I sat alone underneath the single light illuminating my small dining table, head in my hands. I could still see the young girl's hollow eyes staring blankly back at me. I shuddered, reaching into the satchel on the table and slowly pulling out the 5 folders I had retrieved from the filing cabinet at the Norwood. They were legal-sized, olive in color, and only slightly faded. They looked no different from any other folder you might come across at your office. What they signified, however, was something much more sinister and damning. I reached for one but couldn't bring myself to open it. I stared at them for a while before putting them back in the satchel and closing the flap. I was exhausted and terrified, and I had had enough, at least for the night. In the morning, I still couldn't bring myself to look at them. Something had happened to me the night before, the nature of which is hard to explain, but I'll try. I felt dull, not as in uninteresting, but as if the bright and polished parts of me had been scratched off or rubbed away, leaving only raw and faded parts behind. Is that what depression feels like? I think it's easy to pretend you know how you would react if you ever came face to face with a true ghost or spirit. I think what we see in movies and on television desensitizes us to how it would really feel if we experienced it ourselves. That type of terror is not something the mind can manage on its own. I'll tell you that. The body takes over. Instinct, perhaps. Something primal woven into our DNA. It leaves you changed, left me changed. Anyway, it was probably almost a week before I mustered the courage to find out what was inside those folders. The first file appeared to be the file for a 7-year-old boy from South Carolina admitted for the treatment of his leukemia, referred to only as Charlie. I flipped through the pages until I found one with a surgical notes heading, entitled Replantation of Severed Limb of Minor Child. It went on to describe in detail a surgical procedure with the purpose of reattaching the subject's severed hand. The words were technical in nature and I didn't understand some of them. Preparation of the stump included the shortening of both bones radius ulna by 1 centimeter. Repair of the radial artery, ulnar nerve, and median nerve was attempted along with 2 veins, one on the volar aspect and one on the dorsum. I skipped over to the next page and found at the bottom under surgical outcome, failure to reattach hand. Beside it, in a woman's flowing script, something was scribbled. I shuddered at the thought of a 7-year-old losing a hand, but how had Charlie been admitted for leukemia and ended up having his hand severed? Also, who was MS, possibly Mariana? I flipped back to pages and found what I was looking for. Preparation notes. Clinician's third attempt at attaching a child's severed appendage. Subject: Charlie was mildly sedated with heroin hydrochloride and given a local anesthetic at the right wrist. Fully conscious, M assisted with cleaver, severing the hand cleanly. Mother watched from the observation room. I sat in shock as the realization crept in. I didn't want to believe it. I quickly scanned through the other files, but found similar accounts of gruesome reattachment surgeries, which confirmed what I already suspected. Mariana was cutting up children, and then Dr. Norwood was attempting to put them back together again. The girl with the missing eyes, the nursery rhyme, the room upstairs. Even what Victor had said, it all made perfect sense now. Dr. Norwood seemed to be practicing his surgery skills on unsuspecting children who had been admitted for unrelated diseases or ailments. What I didn't understand was how he was getting away with it. Surely the parents didn't stand by and watch their children get cut into pieces by his psychotic nurse. There was more to this, I knew, and I wouldn't find it in these files. I shoved them away in disgust. Afterwards, the depression set in deeper and more fully. I still had a job to do, however, and that was protect the citizens of Mineral Wells, Texas. I tried to go about my usual work handling traffic accidents and other small crimes, the typical happenings of a small Texas town. At one point, I think I was hoping that I would forget what had happened and could return to just being a police officer. Maybe then I would feel normal, whole again. But, as you obviously know by now, Mineral Wells had other plans for me. I heard one day about a young child from a prominent family in town who had suffered an accident while trying to operate a riding lawnmower, obviously without his parents' permission. The blade had mangled his left arm, all the way up to the elbow, and it ended up having to be amputated. It was reported as a terrible tragedy. I must have been the only one that noticed. Based on my close review of the picture the local newspaper ran of the model of mower the child had been injured by, that the child's legs couldn't even reach the pedal. There was also the curious case of Brad Delaney, city council president and member of the First United Methodist Church. One night took the .45 he had hidden under the mattress and killed his wife in cold blood while she slept. One shot, right to the temple, Brad confessed, saying it must have been him that shot her, seeing as how it was his gun and no one else had been in the house, but he didn't remember doing it. They had found him that morning, still asleep next to his murdered wife, the mattress stained in crimson red. One evening I responded to a report of an awful smell coming from a student's room at Weatherford College's Mineral Wells branch. The student had not been seen in several days, and based on the smell coming from the room, the administration did not want to enter the room themselves, fearing at best a dead body and at worst foul play. The college was located on the old site of Fort Walters, which had been a military installation during World War II. I had run across Fort Walters in the historical archives and knew a little about it. At one point during the war, it had been the largest infantry replacement training center in the United States, and several famous World War II soldiers had been trained there. I had run across several accounts of a soldier apparently afraid of being sent off to war, who committed suicide in the barracks, and could still be heard pacing the halls on the anniversary of his death. When I arrived, security led me to the student's room. As reported, the smell was foul and appeared to be that of a decomposing body. The security guard unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. That's when I saw him. In the middle of the room, hanging from a fan by a bedsheet, was the student. His face was bruised and swollen and his eyes were bulging from his head, wide and red. A female student had passed by the room and screamed out, causing the security guard to frantically remove her from the vicinity, leaving me alone with the corpse. I looked around the room to find any signs of a struggle, but nothing else was amiss. That's when I called the investigative unit to take over. I found out several days later about something odd one of the investigative officers had found and couldn't explain. The entire room had been clean, with no books, papers, or clothes out of place, except for a single, folded piece of paper found under the desk. The officers had thought it would be a suicide note, but the words written inside didn't make any sense to them, saying, "I cannot go to war. I'm sorry, Mother. Camp Walters." Several weeks later, while at a coffee shop that I frequent, only bottled water. No coffee for me. I noticed a man several tables over staring at me. When I looked his way, he sort of flinched and acted like he had been looking somewhere else. I made a mental note of his appearance. 60-ish years old, dark-haired and wearing some kind of uniform. He was holding a cup of coffee and I could see that his hands were dirty and gnarled from manual labor. Not exactly the type of person who typically frequents a coffee shop. When I got up to leave, I could feel him watching me. Over the next several weeks, I saw the same man 3 more times, always far enough away to maintain his cover, but close enough to see what I was doing. I was pretty sure he was following me by that point, but honestly had no clue as to why. He seemed harmless enough, so I wasn't frightened, just curious. I got the feeling he was sizing me up, if that makes any sense. One day, I awoke to a note tucked into the side of my door. I opened it and read the hastily scribbled words, written on the back of a receipt from a local garage. Coffee shop, 3 p.m. I'll admit, I was a little nervous this person knew where I lived, although it shouldn't have been hard to follow me here. The coffee shop was a safe, public place, so I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't go. I had never pictured myself as the type of person that would respond dutifully to the instructions written in shady notes stuffed into my doorframe. But the times, they were a-changing. And depression or not, it was time to get back to my investigation. I arrived at 3 to find my new friend seated in his usual spot. He saw me come in. A moment later, he was out of his seat and walking down the hallway at the back of the shop. I followed him, exiting out of the bad door the employees used for taking out the trash. He was standing there, lighting a cigarette, looking generally nervous and disheveled. "Want to tell me why you've been following me, Stan?" I started, probably sounding a bit more stern than I actually felt. I found that people tended to follow instructions better if you spoke to them by name, and the patch on his uniform had provided that information. I just had to be sure. "Mary told me you two had talked, but I wanted to make sure you were okay for myself," he replied nervously. Mary Scott, I thought he must be one of the others she had been talking about, those that knew the truth about mineral wells. "And what did you find out by following me into a coffee shop?" I asked. "Well, for starters, all you drink is regular bottled water, no coffee or tap water. Also, I didn't find any of the crazy water bottles outside in the trash at your apartment." A. Creepy. B. Touché, I thought. This guy was smarter than he looked. "So what am I doing here?" I said. He threw down his cigarette. "Mary said you knew what was going on in mineral wells. Said you may be trying to do something about it." I wasn't sure I trusted him at this point, and he could see it on my face. "Oh, don't worry. I don't drink it either. I've never touched the stuff. My father made sure I understood that." "Who was your father?" "He was an orderly at the old Millings Sanitarium." "That damned place." "I know of it," I said coldly. "I thought you should know what he told me about that place." He paused for a minute, then went on. "He said it was the scariest place he ever stepped foot in. He helped with patients, administered medicine, and cleaned the rooms, so he was familiar with the goings-on. He told me about the different types of treatments they would perform on the patients there: electroshock therapy, experimental surgeries, psychological experiments, sleep deprivation studies, even waterboarding. The screams were the worst part," he said. "I know, they aren't exactly the type of bedtime stories you should tell your children, but I don't think he could help himself. He couldn't sleep for most of his adult life and my mother died when I was young. The place was hellish," he said, "but they always had an influx of new patients, regardless of how bad it was." "Did he say anything about where all the patients came from?" He pieced it together. When news got out about the mineral water, people came from far and wide to be treated. Bathhouses and spas were some of the main attractions for those with less serious ailments of the body. But Millings promised a cure for every dementia and psychological issue under the sun, so the people poured in. Most never left. Business was good. Oh, to be a worm in the peach tree. Worm in the peach tree, I repeated. I hadn't had that turn of phrase before. Oh, it was just something my dad used to say. It basically means someone is taking advantage of a situation. There were also backroom deals with some of the other businesses in town, he went on. I think the Baker management would refer people to Millings as most of the out-of-towners ended up there first. I also know that Dr. Norwood would sometimes send patients their way. My dad was always the most curious about those patients, he said, because they always seemed to be pretty healthy people, at least when they first got there. They always screamed the loudest. It suddenly got cold and dark where we were standing. I looked up to see the thunderheads rolling in. We'd have some weather tonight. I changed the subject. How do you know Mary, and what is her part in all of this? He looked like he was about to respond, then thought better of it. You'll have to ask her about that one. The bitter biting rain that began to fall cut off any further conversation between us. Early the next day, after my shift the previous night, I pulled out the files again. I had a hunch about something Stan had said. Plus, the middle of a thunderstorm is always the perfect time to read about sadistic shit. I found Charlie's file and flipped to the page I was looking for. I found the hastily scribbled words again. Mother sent to MS. It wasn't a person, it was a place. Millings Sanitarium. Dr. Norwood had been sending the perfectly healthy parents of the children he was experimenting on to be experimented on themselves. I looked back through the children's files and my other hunch was confirmed. All of the children were from out of town. South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Tennessee. I finally got it. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s. There's no television, social media, or cells. People keep in touch through letters. For Christ's sake, your child is terminally ill with cancer or some other illness, or perhaps it's you that's sick, and you've lost all hope. Until you hear about Mineral Wells, Texas, home of the crazy water that heals all that ails you. You'll try anything. You'll pack up your bags and make the long journey to Texas. Once you're there, you'll try anything. And you'll never heard from again. For it to work, the families would need to be from anywhere. But Texas, check, you'd need a network of conspirators to make sure all loose ends were tied up. Check. Dr. Norwood got the children, and Millings got the parents or anyone else from the Baker who was dealing with a psychological infirmity. If anyone ever tracked you down at Millings, which would be nearly impossible, who would believe your crazy stories? By that time you'd be so drugged, emotionally scarred, or both, no one would dream of interrupting your treatment. Could law enforcement have been involved as well? The scope of it blew my mind. Think of all of the suffering and death. Think of those poor children. All because of some foul-smelling water, the hope-filled human spirit, and a group of doctors more sadistic than any you could ever imagine. Worms in the peach tree.